Alright guys, so in this video, I'm going to be going over some of the crazy college football potential playoff scenarios now that we are virtually halfway through the season, week 6 out of 13 regular season weeks here in college football, and I'm just going to go conference by conference. Of course, it's mid-season, so we can kind of talk crazy. There are some ridiculous possibilities that very likely will not happen if you followed college football and have experience doing this. We pretty much do the same thing every year where it's like mid-season. Oh my God, what if all these teams finish undefeated? What if all these teams finish with one loss? But this year, it is interesting. It's even more crazy. So let's get into it, starting with the ACC. So you have FSU sitting there at 5-0. They beat LSU week 1. That's kind of a solid win, although LSU is really not looking too good. And then FSU also beat Clemson, although I think Clemson straight up outplayed them in that game. You would think Florida State sits pretty good in terms of their chances of making the college football playoff. It will be interesting if they lose. If Florida State loses a regular season game, then wins the ACC championship, do they make the playoff? I think it depends on a number of different scenarios regarding other conferences. You can see you also have North Carolina sitting at 5-0 right now. I do not see North Carolina finishing the regular season undefeated, but they're a surprise right now. Clemson, they have the 2 losses already. They can play spoiler. Miami got the horrible loss. They're virtually out, already. Louisville is the other team everyone's really talking about. So Louisville and Florida State do not face each other. They both might be undefeated. We'll have to see. Louisville has a very favorable schedule. I still think they're going to lose to someone. It's not like they have crazy talent, but it is something to monitor. And then you can see the other team everyone's talking about, at least when it comes to the ACC, is the breakout season that Duke has had. And could you imagine if Duke would have beaten Notre Dame and Riley Leonard didn't get injured? They're sitting at 5-0 right now. I mean, there could have been a scenario with the ACC where Duke and Miami are both undefeated at this point as well, which would be crazy. But I would expect right now from the ACC, North Carolina, even though they have 0 losses, I don't think they make the playoff. Louisville, they would be a massive surprise. But it could be interesting depending on what happens if multiple teams finish undefeated. How does that affect things? Florida State and Louisville both possibly could finish undefeated. We will see. Next, taking a look at the Big 12, you can see you've got Oklahoma and Texas very likely due for a rematch in the Big 12 championship game. The thought process here is, let's say Oklahoma and Texas win out. Texas beats Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship. Where does that leave us in regards to, do both of those teams make the playoffs considering they split and they both have 1 loss? How does that affect the other conferences? The thing with this is Oklahoma is going to be double-digit favorites against everyone in the Big 12. The Big 12 is horrible this year outside of Texas and Oklahoma. You do have West Virginia. People have been talking about. They're at Oklahoma in a game a few weeks from now. They're going to be 20-point underdogs. They're not going to win that game. But basically everyone in this conference outside of Oklahoma and Texas is down this year. And the Big 12 is going to lose both Oklahoma and Texas, so we will see how that conference does next year, but they are adding teams. Either way, this is a situation where if Texas doesn't trip up and then they beat Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship, you could be looking at 2 teams in. If Oklahoma beats Texas again in the Big 12 championship, so a second win against them, Texas is out, Oklahoma is in. It's pretty simple. It is interesting to follow when it comes to the Big 12 possibly getting 2 teams in the playoff, even though they are not a good conference this year. Moving on to the Big 10, you do have Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan, of course. Those are 3 of the top 10 teams right now in college football. Very interesting to see how those teams split their games. Does Ohio State go 2-0 against Penn State and Michigan, 1-1, or 0-2? Do they all go 1-1 against each other? That would really mess things up. Michigan would probably be the team where you would want to finish the regular season undefeated. The problem for Michigan, if they go 11-1 and miss the Big Ten championship because of tiebreakers, they have such a horrible non-conference schedule, I don't think they're going to make it. Ohio State, at least they do have the road win at Notre Dame. No, we'll see with Notre Dame. Notre Dame might drop a few games here, though. And then Penn State, they kind of have an okay win against West Virginia. I know West Virginia's looked better, but still, I don't think that's a great win. Either way, those three teams are probably going to be battling out for one spot. I would be pretty surprised if if two of them made it at this point, just based on how college football is setting up. But you could see possibly two of the teams make it. Ohio State, Michigan, if they're both undefeated at the end of the regular season. Maybe it's a similar setup to last year where the loser still makes it, depending. And then I do think Wisconsin is a team where they're a disruptor. They're probably going to be 7-1 going into that Ohio State, or I think 6-1 going into that Ohio State game. Probably a top 25 team. Maryland, I think, is a fringe top 25 team. Iowa, I would say they just have no offense. And then, the conference gets a lot worse with Rutgers being the next team after that. Moving on to the Pac-12, so this conference, they're going to start facing each other. USC, let me just say this, they've got a 0% chance of making the playoff. They have a brutal schedule, and we've seen now week after week after week where USC is on the brink of losing to lesser Pac-12 teams. When they start facing some of these better teams, they're going to have two losses by the end of the regular season. I'm very sure of that. You do have the Oregon-Washington game coming up, so one of those teams is guaranteed to get a loss. Also, Oregon faces USC. Also, Washington's going to be facing other teams. All these teams are going to beat each other. And I do think the Pac-12 is in a strong position right now to get one team into the playoff, unless you get a real unfortunate situation where you possibly have an undefeated, a Pac-12 championship where it's, an undefeated team versus a two-loss team, and let's say the two-loss team wins, then do you put, the team that has one loss coming off a loss, they're not even Pac-12 champions, into the playoff? That's where it could kind of go south for the Pac-12. The issue is with the Pac-12, these teams face each other. This isn't like the SEC where Alabama never faces Georgia and they can just always get two teams in the playoff because they never face each other in the regular season. All these teams are facing each other. Like USC's schedule, again, is brutal. When it comes to the playoff, I would say the contenders right now in the Pac-12, Oregon, Washington, and honestly, that's probably it. I mean, you'd say, USC, they're 6-0. Again, I just don't see it with how they've played, with how bad their, defense has been. Maybe you can say, well, it's the Pac-12. They can win on their talent. Even if they're not really a national title contender, they can still make the playoff. I guess we'll have to see. Is there the chance to get two teams in the playoff? It would have to work out perfectly for the Pac-12 where Oregon would have to beat Washington, but Washington would have to beat USC, but USC would have to beat Oregon, and then you have a one-loss team that doesn't make the Pac-12 champion. They would have to get in, and then two one-loss teams playing the Pac-12 champion, and the winner gets in. It would be a situation like that. Oregon State, they have a too bad of a defense. They're going to lose more games. Utah's going to lose more games. UCLA is going to lose more games. Washington State's going to lose more games. All of those teams are going to cannibalize themselves. They're all going to have 2 or 3 losses guaranteed. It comes down to Oregon, Washington, and USC, and possibly Oregon and Washington, especially if that game this next week is very close. Maybe Oregon loses a really close game on the road, and then they have a rematch in the Pac-12 championship game, and then Oregon wins that game. That's how you would get 2 Pac-12 teams in. And then the SEC, obviously FPI has Alabama at number 1 here in the SEC. That, Georgia, they stabilized. They started 0. It's just so tough. And I said this last week with teams like Georgia and Michigan. Their schedule allowed them to play horrible early, and they just don't get punished for it. Like Georgia, if they faced a tough team, like a really good non-conference team, they very likely would have one loss at this point and have absolutely no margin for error. But because they played a horrible schedule, now they're just coasting at 6-0. And there is the argument. I mean, think about this, guys. Georgia and whoever they face, I don't think Alabama's going to finish with one loss, I'll be honest. Alabama has a tough schedule, and even though I've liked Alabama this year because I feel like they're kind of being disrespected because everyone overreacts, Alabama lost a game, so what? It seems like Bama's going to suffer another loss, and when it comes to that division, Ole Miss certainly is going to get another loss. LSU already has 2 losses, so they're probably out at this point, and they've got a horrible defense. The question is, if Georgia goes undefeated, they've got a terrible schedule. Let's say they go undefeated, and then they lose to whoever they face in the SEC championship. I don't know, is that LSU? Is it Bama? Probably the winner of Bama LSU is who they're going to face. Would Georgia make the playoffs as a one-loss team that doesn't win the SEC, that has a horrible schedule, but a team that won, and this is where you go back, they won both the college football playoff the last 2 years. They're back-to-back national champions. Do they make the playoffs even with a horrible schedule, with one loss, not winning the SEC? That's where it starts to get really tough. And that would be the situation. Obviously, if Georgia goes undefeated, they win the SEC, they're going to be the 1 seed. That's just the reality of it. Unless you get a crazy team with a resume that's just ridiculous, that's also undefeated. So that is the real setup with the SEC. I do not see the SEC getting 2 teams in at all, because Bama's going to get another loss. Ole Miss is going to get another loss. But the question becomes, maybe Tennessee. Well, I don't see Tennessee. Yeah, Tennessee's sitting with 1 loss already. I know they've looked better. They're coming off their bye. But with Joe Milton, the real question is, when it comes to the SEC championship, if Georgia, who's probably very likely going to be undefeated, if they lose that game, do they still get in? That's the real question. And then you move on to the potential. This is for, who's going to be in the New Year's Six game, the Group of 5 team. Right now, I'll tell you, the Mountain West is a good conference, and you have 3 teams, and this FPI is being real disrespectful towards Wyoming. Wyoming's a good team. I don't know why they're below Boise State. But guys, it's Air Force, Fresno State, Wyoming. We just saw Fresno State lose last night. Air Force is the only undefeated remaining. They're top 50 in terms of FPI. I think they should be top 30. They're a really good team. Of course, Air Force doesn't throw, so that limits them, but they can also limit possessions for other teams. Huge game in the Mountain West next week. Air Force hosting Wyoming. Right now, I would say Air Force is the favorite to make, a New Year's Six bowl from the Group of 5. It'll be interesting to see what happens when it comes to that. But either way, guys, that is just the current setup. When it comes to teams that can make the playoff right now, realistically, in my opinion, the teams I would say that realistically can, from the SEC, honestly, I would just say Georgia. I mean, you can say Bama as well, but they already have 1 loss. So I would say Georgia from the SEC, that's it at this point. You might say, oh, Tennessee. I just don't see it. So, and then from the Pac-12, Oregon, Washington, and you do have to say USC because they're still undefeated. It's those 3 teams for me. I think all the other teams are guaranteed to get another loss. From the Big Ten, it's Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan. That's it. That's easy. From the Big 12, it's Oklahoma and Texas. That's it. And then from the ACC, it's Florida State. Do you want to throw North Carolina in there? I really don't, but they are undefeated. And then Louisville. Florida State, North Carolina, and Louisville. It'll be interesting to see if Florida State and Louisville finish undefeated. What if do they end up both making the playoff? I don't think Louisville's finishing undefeated, but it is something interesting to look at. But guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.